Okay, we are back with part 2 of The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. And we're going to be doing chapters, we'll see, I guess, 4, 5, and... No, we already did chapter 4. So 5, 6, 7, possibly 8, depending how long this video goes. So, chapter 5 is titled Male Sexual Being, which talks about men's relationship with sex. And she starts out talking about how sex is not necessarily seen as something that is necessarily pleasing, but something that is mainly just to satisfy men and their sexual desires. And she even says here in this part, no matter how many men in our nation are celibate or have only occasional sexual experiences, people still believe that sex is something men have to have. Underlying this assumption is the belief that if men are not sexually active, they will act out or go crazy. This is why male-on-male sexual violence is accepted in our nation's prisons. This is why rape, whether date rape, marital rape, or stranger rape, is still not deemed a serious crime. This is why the rape of children, especially when conducted by mild-mannered, nice men, is allowed. If this were not so, celebrities accused of sexually abusing children would no longer be cultural icons. The assumption that he's got to have it underlies much of our culture's acceptance of male sexual violence. It is why many people continue to believe that anyone who is raped may have asked for it by seductive dress or behavior, no matter how many television programs have aired the facts about sexual violence. And this is interesting to really see after all this stuff that's going on with Diddy, who else? A lot of politicians, what else? Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Cosby, R. Kelly. So a lot of notable men, when they get accused of sexual assault, pop culture turns into a whole different thing when it comes to sensationalizing the hot topics, especially with Diddy. People are paying attention that he's been having sex with men, but he was raping and sexually assaulting male sex workers. And they talked about the baby oil, the sensationalization of the baby oil and all that stuff, but not the abuse and the harm that he has inflicted on the victims that are men and women. So that's interesting to really explore. And she also ties how this men's need for sex is their male desire for dominance. And she also goes into say why heteronormativity is also something that is just normal in America. She said, lying about sexuality is an accepted part of patriarchal masculinity. Sex is where many men act out because it is the only social arena where the patriarchal promise of dominion can be easily realized. So when it comes to gay men especially, there's the top-bottom discourse, people the masculine, then the one that's penetrating is who is considered the top, tends to be the person that has all these expectations, and tends to be the one that we're gonna say their pleasures tend to be focused more than the people that's getting penetrated. So same thing when it comes to when men and women have sex. Men tend to be the one that's pleased when they have sex, but when it comes to the women, how often do they achieve an orgasm or anything of that sort? And what else we got here? She also talks about sexual repression and sex addiction and how people use sex as a way to cope with the loss that patriarchy takes away from them. So sex is seen as the one time where patriarchal men try to be intimate with someone that they are attracted to, whether they're female sexual partner or male sexual partner. So that's their moment where they can focus on what pleases them. And let's see, what pages it talked about. Yeah, she says sexual repression fuels the lust of boys and men. Encouraged to relate to sex in an addictive way by the patriarchal thinking which says he's got to have it, males must then adjust to a world where they can rarely get it, or never get it as much as they want, or where they can get it only by coercing and manipulating someone who does not want it, usually someone female. In The Heart of the Soul, Gary Zukav and Linda Francis describe the characteristics of individuals addicted to sexual obsessions. They cannot rest from thoughts of sex. They move from one encounter to the next. Each sexual experience brings only temporary relief from their craving, and it quickly returns. No amount of sexual activity can satisfy it. They explain that the sexual craving is not for sex, but for something deeper. The fact that the craving always returns is the clue that addictive sexuality is not simply about getting sex. For the patriarchal male, be he straight or gay, addictive sexuality is fundamentally about the need to constantly affirm and reaffirm one's selfhood. It is only through sex that he can experience selfhood, then sex has to be constantly foregrounded. So, yeah, so pretty much that's how a lot of sex addiction goes into, how people go into that direction, is when they are trying to get away from a pain where they feel like sex is the way to cope with that pain. And it can be seen as a way of self-loathing. So when you're trying to engage in sex, even when you're not even really feeling it, that's when it also gets into this mode where there needs to be some where sexual impulsivity is really lacking in control. And that also reinforces rape culture as well, because it's saying that whenever the man wants sex, you should give it to him, or something like that. So that puts into like marital rape direction, statutory rape, and other forms of sexual violence. And that's how also when it comes to like casual sex, or it also doesn't take the time for a person to really learn another person's body and what pleases their body, instead of just self-gratification. And yeah, she also talked about it. Yeah, she also talked about it here. To take the inherent positive sexuality of males and turn it into violence is the patriarchal crime that is perpetuated against the male body, a crime that masses of men have yet to possess the strength to report. Men know what is happening. They simply have been taught not to speak the truth of their bodies, the truth of their sexualities. And that's where a lot of queer antagonism comes into play. More often than not, gay males, unless they have consciously decided otherwise, are as patriarchal in their thinking about masculinity, about sexuality, as their heterosexual counterparts. Their investment in patriarchy is an intensely disordered desire because they are enamored of the very ideology that fosters and promotes homophobia. Now that patriarchal straight men have been compelled through mass media to face the fact that homosexual males are not chicks with dicks, that they can and do embody patriarchal masculinity. Straight male sexual dominance of biological females has intensified, for it is really the only factor that distinguishes straight from gay. Concurrently, homophobia becomes amplified among heterosexual men because its overt expression is useful as a way to identify among apparently similar macho men who is gay and who is straight. And it also talks about pornography, and that's the outlet where a lot of people get educated about their sexual desires, and it's through pornography. It also can be introduce them to sexual violence in a way where it doesn't seem like sexual violence, because you got willing participants that are in you got willing performers that are in pornographic material. And where it says, yes, it says here, so when it comes to patriarchal pornography, Hook says, it is not just anti-feminist backlash that has led to the normalization of pornographic sexual violence in our mass media and in common sexual practice. The desire to keep men from feeling and naming their pain fuels the need for consistent brainwashing. So that's how patriarchy comes into like men's sex relationship with sex and sexuality. And she also says here, if masses of men could recover this fundamental passion for their own bodies, that shift away from patriarchal sex might lead us toward a true sexual revolution. To recover the power and passion of male sexuality unsullied by patriarchal assault, males of all ages must be allowed to speak openly of their sexual longing. They must be able to be sexual beings in a space where patriarchal thinking can no longer make violation the only means of attaining sexual pleasure. This is a tough job, and until males learn how to do it, they will not be satisfied. So that dominator, subordinate mindset that patriarchy allows to let men and women think about the ways gender it works and how community works needs to be rid of. And is also especially they need to get away from that mindset when it comes to sexual pleasure and sexual activity. And that is it for chapter 5. And chapter 6 is titled Work. What's Love Got to Do with It? And this talks about men's relationship with labor and working. And it talks about male discontent for working due to exploitation while in competition with women as sole providers. So it pretty much talks about how the feminist movement, when it comes to like having women in the workforce, people hate working, have always hated working and stuff like that. But it's like another added layer when you're in competition with another demographic where that historically hasn't been in that same workforce as you have, but once they got into the workforce, now it's a competition up in the workforce. So that's why the gender pay gap is the way it is. And that's how we got into the conversation of also when it comes to the breadwinner and the providing and protecting that has been deemed to be the masculine requirements in a household has also been taken into position by women, because women are starting to get into the workforce and they're starting to be economically independent and they're starting to provide for their households as well. So when, say, like a woman is the breadwinner or of the household, the men in the household might feel threatened. They might see like they're being emasculated when really we can just coexist. We just have two different incomes. And Hooks also talks about the sacrifices people are willing to do for work. And she says work stands in the way of love for most men then because the long hours they work often drain their energies. There is little or no time left for emotional labor, for doing the work of love. The conflict between finding time for work and finding time for love and loved ones is rarely talked about in our nation. It is simply assumed in patriarchal culture that men should be willing to sacrifice meaningful emotional connections to get the job done. No one has really tried to examine what men feel about the loss of time with children, partners, loved ones, and the loss of time for self-development. And this is definitely something that women tend to not have a problem with because women have always been taught relational skills. They have always been taught to care for the children, when the men are just taught to bring home the bacon and bring out the money and stuff like that. So now, since women are in the workforce, what does that place now? It brings a different type of expectation for men. And also this relationship with work. So like people let work disconnect them from others, disconnect them from trying to find joy in the little things in life, trying to enjoy, having a hobby or something like that. And I would say that's so relatable because I used to do poetry and stuff like that. And ever since I've started getting into the workforce, I've done less of that because I just do not feel like the motivation to continue giving labor to something else. But the only thing is that labor was giving me some pleasure and allowed me to really be passionate about something. So that's why a lot of men probably don't get into other things other than working. They don't get into say what possibly go into the arts or being a musician or doing something of the sort, doing anything of the sort. And what else is there over here? Yes, this talks about when women enter the workforce in a competition amongst genders. Hook says, competition with other men in the workplace can make it all the more difficult for men to express feelings or to take time alone. The male who seeks solitude in a workplace, especially during downtimes, is seen as suspect. Yet when men gather together at work, they rarely have meaningful conversations. They jeer, they grandstand, they joke, but they do not share feelings. They relate in a scripted, limited way, careful to remain within the emotional boundaries set by patriarchal thinking about masculinity. The rules of patriarchal manhood remind them that it is their duty as men to refuse relatedness. And yeah, so men are not really taught to really like solace in each other, seek affirmation and joy within each other. Like they're on who has the best masculinity contest. They'll probably talk about sports. They'll talk about their wives getting on their nerves or something like that. But when it comes to how work drains them, or when it comes to how society puts them in an unhealthy position where they have been taught to get rid of their innocence, get rid of expressing themselves, get rid of what gives them joy without the shame that came with it, there was no space for that for when men are in the workplace. And Hooks also says here, feminist movement has had very little impact on the masses of working class women who were in the workplace prior to the movement and who still remain there, just as dissatisfied and discontent with their lot as the men in their lives. Poor and working class women have always known that the everyday work experience places men in an environment where they feel powerless and where they are unable to articulate that on patriarchal terms. To use Faluti's words, they feel less than masculine. So this is where Hooks critiques the mainstream liberal feminism that is mainly perpetrated by white women and white feminists, in which they pretty much just want to get out of the house. They were the stay-at-home wives. They were the women that were in they were the socialites, and they were the elites. They were the spouses of the elites and things of that sort. But when it comes to working class, everybody was working when they were working class. The women that were teachers, the women that were the women that were the labor organizers, the women that were hospital workers, they were hotel workers. There were always women working, but they did not get the mainstream support that the elite women that were getting. So Bell Hooks was calling that out. And she also talked about job depression and how people work their life away. And that's a lot with what patriarchy does, because that's why I would say that's probably why a lot of older people, when they're way past their retirement age, they don't see what else in life they can do other than working. So the thought of having to go outside of work gives them an existential crisis. So they have to so once they see more value in work, they lose a sense of identity and a sense of self, where it leads to them going into a deep depression and possibly lead to other issues such as health issues, alienation from other support systems, alienation from the family, and other areas. And that is it for chapter 6. And now for chapter 7, which is titled Feminist Manhood. We're talking more about men's relationship to patriarchy. And Hook says here, patriarchal culture is the system that men were born within and socialized to accept. Yet in all areas of their lives, most men have rebelled in small ways against the patriarchy, have resisted absolute allegiance to patriarchal thinking and practice. Most men have clearly been willing to resist patriarchy when it interferes with individual desire, but they have not been willing to embrace feminism as a movement that would challenge, change, and ultimately end the patriarchy. It was difficult for women committed to feminist change to face the reality that the problem did not lie just with men. Facing that reality required more complex theorizing. It required acknowledging the role women play in maintaining and perpetuating patriarchy and sexism. As more women moved away from destructive relationships with men, it was easier to see the whole picture. It was easier to see that even if individual men divested themselves of patriarchal privilege, the system of patriarchy, sexism, and male domination would still remain intact, and women would still be exploited and oppressed. Despite this change in feminist agendas, visionary feminist thinkers who had never been anti-male did not and do not receive mass media attention. As a consequence, the popular notion that feminists hate men continues to prevail. So that pretty much gets into how the feminists hate all men talking point, and showing how much that's not true. There are men that do acknowledge that that women are being oppressed by patriarchy, but it's not enough for men to just call out that patriarchy. It's something that needs to be a collective struggle. Like, it needs to be a mass movement and coalitions of people to dismantle patriarchy. And she also talked about this reformist feminism and showing how even reforming the system isn't going to work. Hook says reformist feminist women would not make this call because they were the group of women, mostly white women with class privilege, who had pushed the idea that all men were powerful in the first place. These were the women for whom feminist liberation was more about getting their piece of the power pie and less about freeing masses of women or less powerful men from sexist oppression. They were not mad at their powerful daddies and husbands who kept poor men exploited and oppressed. They were mad that they were not being given equal access to power. Now that many of those women have gained power and especially economic parity with the men of their class, they have pretty much lost interest in feminism. So some of these feminists only participate in advocating against feminism when it no longer benefits them. So when they actually benefit from the system, all of a sudden they're quiet, and that is a lot when it comes to like how white women in those areas move and rich women move, especially rich black women. I'm gonna say that. Like, yeah, like it's not just white women that are enforcing what white supremacist capitalist patriarchy enforces. It's whoever enforces the system. And she talked about the men's movement. Yeah, she says here, Once the new man, that is the man changed by feminism, was represented as a wimp, as overcooked broccoli dominated by powerful females who were secretly longing for his macho counterpart, masses of men lost interest. Reacting to this inversion of gender roles, men who were sympathetic chose to stop trying to play a role in female-led feminist movement and became involved with the men's movement. Positively, the men's movement emphasized the need for men to get in touch with their feelings, to talk with other men. Negatively, the men's movement continued to promote patriarchy by a tacit insistence that in order to be fully self-actualized, men needed to separate from women. The idea that men needed to separate from women to find their true selves just seemed like the old patriarchal message dressed up in a new package. So she's saying how there was this movement where men do try to coalition with amongst each other and try to find solace in each other. But what Bell Hooks has been noticing is that it was another way to rehash misogynistic ideals. It's more covert. It's more benevolent and more quiet with misogyny. So she realized, like, no, we need men and women back together. We need a coalition where men are also taking it apart and advocating on feminist work. Yeah, she says that same men's movement was often critical of women and feminism while making no sustained critique of patriarchy, which is the real enemy here. Feminism is the one that's trying to save them. And what else? She said that there needs to be a redefinition of masculinity, and said that patriarchal masculinity, which today, contemporary terms, we call that toxic masculinity, which encourages violence in the sake of the American empire. And there's this superiority rights for males to dominate. Yeah, she says here, this is why the term patriarchal masculinity is so important, for it identifies male difference as being always and only about the superior rights of males to dominate, be their subordinates, females, or any group deemed weaker by any means necessary. Rejecting this model for a feminist masculinity means that we must define maleness as a state of being rather than as performance. Male being, maleness, masculinity must stand for the essential core goodness of the self, of the human body, than that of a body that has a penis. Many of the critics who have written about masculinity suggest that we need to do away with the term, that we need an end to manhood. Yet such a stance furthers the notion that there is something inherently evil, bad, or unworthy about maleness. So Bell Hooks isn't saying that masculinity is inherently bad, but the way patriarchy defines masculinity is problematic and toxic and violent. So we need a redefinition where you can be strong, you can protect your family and all that stuff, but you can't enforce violence to benefit yourself. You should try to look towards community for help as well. And she also says, no matter how many modern-day seers assure us that power struggles are not an effective model for human relations, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal culture continues to insist that domination must be the organizing principle of today's civilization. And a solution that Hooks provides is that we need to offer men a different way of being. We must first replace the dominator model with a partnership model that sees interbeing and interdependency as the organic relationship of all living beings. In the partnership model, selfhood, whether one is female or male, is always at the core of one's identity. Patriarchal masculinity teaches males to be pathologically narcissistic, infantile, and psychologically dependent for self-definition on the privileges that they receive from having been born male. Hence, many males feel that their very existence is threatened if these privileges are taken away. And the partnership model male identity, like its female counterpart, would be centered around the notion of an essential goodness that is inherently relationally oriented. Rather than assuming that males are born with the will to aggress, the culture would assume that males are born with the inherent will to connect. Feminist masculinity presupposes, she says, rather than defining strength as power over, feminist masculinity defines strength as one's capacity to be responsible for self and others. So we need to get away from the culture of domination and more into a culture of connecting with others. And Hooks also says, she has some really good quotes in this section. She says, until we are willing to question many of the specifics of the male sex role, including most of the 7 norms and stereotypes that psychologist Robert Levant names in a listing of its chief constituents, avoiding femininity, restrictive emotionality, seeking achievement and status, self-reliance, aggression, homophobia, and non-relational attitudes towards sexuality, we are going to deny men their full humanity. Feminist masculinity will have as its chief constituents integrity, self-love, emotional awareness, assertiveness, and relational skill, including the capacity to be empathic, autonomous, and connected. The core of feminist masculinity is a commitment to gender equality and mutuality as crucial to interbeing and partnership in the creating and sustaining of life. Such a commitment always privileges nonviolent action over violence, peace over war, life over death. And she also went into like how patriarchy is killing men also, not just women. She referred to Olga Silverstein, who is one of the authors she referenced in here, and she said Olga Silverstein said that men aren't surviving very well. We send them to war to kill and be killed. They're lying down in the middle of highways to prove their manhood in imitation of a scene in a recent movie about college football. They're dying of heart attacks in early middle age, killing themselves with liver and lung disease via the manly pursuits of drinking and smoking, committing suicide at roughly 4 times the rate of women, becoming victims of homicide, generally at the hands of other men, 3 times as often as women, and therefore living about 8 years less than women. So she's saying how patriarchy sets men up for death. And it also enables this sense of fearing others and this affirmation that men would be better off if they are in a state of aloneness, which is that individual American exceptionalism talking point. And that sense of aloneness is because there's no community. That's what creates this state of that leads into suicide and depression and anything of that sort where problems can arise. And Hooks argues, she states that feminism makes it possible for women and men to know love. Love cannot coexist in any relationship that is based on domination and coercion. Males cannot love themselves in patriarchal culture if their very self-definition relies on submission to patriarchal rules. When men embrace feminist thinking and practice, which emphasizes the value of mutual growth and self-actualization in all relationships, their emotional well-being will be enhanced. A genuine feminist politics always brings us from bondage to freedom, from lovelessness to loving. And yes, she says that feminism is an introductory to genuine love and companionship and community work. And for people to go by patriarchy standards, you're not going to get love. And that is it for chapter 7. And chapter 8 is titled Popular Culture, Media Masculinity, which pretty much goes into further talks about how patriarchy is perpetrated through the media. And she talked about the news about crime, television shows. I mentioned the Hulk turning green, the Gulf War, the war in Iraq, gangster rap. She went into hip hop. The hillside, she talked about a lot of how mass shootings and serial killers tend to be men because the media always portrays like the serial killers, especially when they're white, as like the lone wolf. Like there are people that were socially alienated from society, when it's just we just reward white men for being alone and being individual on themselves because that's what masculinity rewards. And more and other examples where men are seeking emotional support, and she used the movies Goodwill Hunting, Monsters Ball, and Igby Goes Down as examples. And the thing that Bell Hooks notices in those movies is that the men start to seek emotional support after a tragedy happens, so they were reactive in their healing journey. Because in Monsters Ball, if y'all seen that movie, which I got problems with that because it's a cop movie, a cop seeks solace from a black single mother after his son committed suicide because he's traumatized by what the police department put him through, because his son was also a cop, and there was a death. Funny enough, Diddy was in that movie. Because the character that Diddy was playing was going through the death penalty, and the police officer's son, who was also a cop, is so traumatized from it that he committed suicide because I'm tired. I don't want to work in the police force no more. This is not something that I want to do. And the cop was telling his son, like, you're not man enough or something like that. And then puts this prison of masculinity onto the son that made him succumb to his death. And another movie, Bell Hooks talk about Igby Goes Down. I think this is one of the movies where a man has been taught that he has cancer or something and he has not too long to live. So he's living life and like it's every minute, like every second, like it's his last second, which we should do that even when we don't know when we're going to be dying. So that's the thing. And I think she said what's interesting about Goodwill Hunting is that this is the time where a white man gets coddled for his behavior, and we don't give that same grace to black men. And she says here, the vast majority of contemporary films send the message that males cannot escape the beast within. They can pretend, they can dissimulate, but they can never break patriarchy's hold onto their consciousness. And that is it for chapter 8. And chapter 9 is entitled Healing the Male Spirit. And she went again about that single mother and the son dynamic and patriarchy. And did I highlight anything there? Yes, she says here, many mothers in patriarchal cultures silence the wild spirit in their sons. The spirit of wonder and playful tenderness for fear their sons will be weak, will not be prepared to be macho men, real men other men will envy and look up to. And she also says here, everyday mothers are ruthlessly and brutally terminating their emotional connection with male children in order to turn them over to patriarchy, whether to an actual unfeeling father or to a symbolic father. To always wear a mask as a way of asserting masculine presence is to always live the lie, to be perpetually deprived of an authentic sense of identity and well-being. This falseness causes males to experience intense emotional pain. And I think this is one of my favorite quotes here. You can't be happy living a lie. And so they're furious at being caught in a lie, but they don't know how to break out of it, so they just go further into it. Failure to examine the victimization of men keeps us from understanding maleness, from uncovering the space of connection that might lead more men to seek feminist transformation. So it's just the fact that men, there needs to be some grace given to them, but not to the point where it's coddling or excusing harmful behavior. And an example that Bell Hooks brought was The Color Purple, which that's one of the books that I'm going to read soon, especially since the new movie came out last year, and people are starting to have a different lens on that story, especially because they actually haven't read the book, because the character of Mr. Ox actually did have a redemption arc in the Color Purple story. because we have to see that Mr. has also been socialized by patriarchy, and that's how he became to be the abuser that Celie was introduced to and lived a life with him. And once she saw that he has been doing the work to combat everything that he's been taught since he was born, especially with his father, because his father was like no better. Like, his father was like, women are inferior. And once Celie actually saw that transformation, she saw that there is hope in him. It's just that it unfortunately took her to get to a place where she had to seek freedom from him and love him from a distance, where she sees that change. And Bell Hooks says that that's what everyone needs to move through life on. Like, yes, you have every right to like really not connect with your abuser, but we have to see, like, there's a cycle of abuse that's happening, and we have to find out ways to combat that, so the next generation doesn't socialize into that same trap. And she says here, she also used Antoine Fisher as an example, which I need to see that movie again because I remember enjoying that. Hook says, to heal, men must learn to feel again. They must learn to break the silence, to speak the pain. Often men, to speak the pain, first turn to the women in their lives and are refused a hearing. In many ways, women have bought into the patriarchal masculine mystique. Asked to witness a male expressing feelings, to listen to those feelings and respond, they may simply turn away. There was a time when I would often ask the man in my life to tell me his feelings, and yet when he began to speak, I would either interrupt or silence him by crying, sending him the message that his feelings were too heavy for anyone to bear, so it was best if he kept them to himself. As I matured, as my feminist consciousness developed to include the recognition of patriarchal abusive men, I could hear male pain. I could see men as comrades and fellow travelers on the journey of life and not as existing merely to provide instrumental support. Since men have yet to organize a feminist men's movement that would proclaim the rights of men to emotional awareness and expression, we will not know how many men have indeed cried to express feelings only to have the women in their lives tuned out or be turned off. Talking with men, I have been stunned with individual males would confess to sharing intense feelings with a male buddy, only to have that buddy either interrupt or silence the sharing, offer no response, or distance himself. So, yeah, in reality, the more patriarchal a man is, the more disconnected he must be from feeling. If he cannot feel, he cannot connect. If he cannot connect, he cannot be intimate. So she's saying that patriarchy just doesn't allow men to be vulnerable, and if we block that space for them to be vulnerable, we're still kind of enforcing patriarchy because it doesn't allow them to really open themselves up. But that's the thing, they also need to open themselves to criticism as well. Like, they shouldn't be silenced, they shouldn't be cut off, they shouldn't be invalidated by what they're going through. Like, it's their experience, but they have to realize how their actions not only harm themselves but also harm others. And let me see, is there anything else that I highlighted in this chapter? Actually, yes, I said something about being intimate, caring for the soul as relational skills. So, women are taught to have relational skills. Men also need to be taught relational skills. So it can make that process of healing and opening up for vulnerability helpful, because they need to know how to have those relational skills. And she says here that there also needs to be compassion with those men. And she said, most men in our society believe in This is the care of the soul that males and females must attend to if we are to sustain life on the planet, if we are to live fully and well. Most men in our society believe in high powers, and yet they have learned to devalue spiritual life, to violate their own sense of the sacred. Hence, the work of the spiritual restoration of seeing the souls of men as sacred is essential if we are to create a culture in which men can love. When the hearts of men are full of compassion and open to love, then, as the Dalai Lama states, there is no need for a temple or church, for mosque or synagogue, no need for complicated philosophy, doctrine, or dogma. For our own heart or own mind is a temple, and the doctrine is compassion. So, yeah, she's pretty much saying that if men, any chance men get to be in touch with their emotional selves, they can combat patriarchy that way. And that is the end of chapter 9. And chapter 10 is titled Reclaiming Male Integrity, in which she explains more about how patriarchy rids men of having their sense of self and identity, because it makes them have to perform masculinity where it rewards them in society. And she's saying that they're lying to themselves. It gets to the point where they're lying to themselves. She states here, people who learn to lie to themselves and others cannot love because they are crippled in their capacity to tell the truth and therefore unable to trust. So if you're not telling the truth, you're not loving, because love comes with hard truths. And she said that in patriarchy, relationships are based on power, control, secrecy, fear, shame, isolation, and distance. And she also says, patriarchy encourages men to surrender their integrity and to live lives of denial. By learning the arts of compartmentalization, dissimulation, and disassociation, men are able to see themselves as acting with integrity in cases in which they are not. So they can either convince themselves to have integrity. Patriarchy makes them operate in a way when they're not being honest with themselves. Because when you keep lying to yourself, the parts that are true to you and authentic to you, you compartmentalize them, meaning you hide them in a way where only someone who actually genuinely cares for you can reach that. But the people that you perform that, they do not get that. And in patriarchy, that can be really hard. Because you can say that's pretty much like how queer men had to operate as well. Well, queer people in general, but for queer men, they can never win the masculinity game because they're not solely attracted to women, but they had to compartmentalize their sexuality, who they are. They're not going to be happy with themselves when they go down through life. And she also said that also leads to depression, alcoholism, and workaholism, and substance abuse, and anything else. She says here, much of the depression men suffer is directly related to their inability to be whole. Even though they have been socialized to create and maintain false selves, most men remember the true self that once existed. And it is that memory of loss, coupled with rage at the world, which encourage the surrender of the self, that engenders depression. And she also talked about how this inability to be whole and grow is where is also been something that patriarchy enforces, because I think people, they go to school, they go to college, they get married, and all of a sudden all their learning and education stops there. They remain stoic and conventional to that point, but you're always going to be learning. As long as you're breathing, you're learning something. There's always going to be something new to learn, and opening your heart out to learning and having a willingness to learn and unlearn things, that's a skill. That is a skill that patriarchy does not want you to have. And Yeah, she also says here, when a man's emotional capacity to mourn is arrested, he is likely to be frozen in time and unable to complete the process of growing up. Men need to mourn the old self and create the space for a new self to be born if they are to change and to be wholly transformed. If a man is not willing to break patriarchal rules that say that he should never change, especially to satisfy someone else, particularly a female, then he will choose being right over being loved. That's deep. He will turn away from loved ones and choose his manhood over his personhood, isolation over connectedness. Men who are whole can speak their fear without shame. They do not need to wear the false mask of fearlessness. Fathers have been unable to share with their sons that they are afraid. They fear not measuring up to the expectations of sons. They fear that the son will see their jealousy and envy of the boy who has not yet severed his relation to feeling, who is not emotionally closed off. And it's like, wow, I didn't even like, because I forgot what I read, but a lot of there's a trend of like parents that are actually like jealous of their child because they did not grow up the same way that their child didn't grow up the same way that they did. So parents started to envy their child or something like that. And that's what a lot of fathers do with their sons as well, especially sons that are queer or something like that. Like their fathers did not get that opportunity to be freely themselves. If the father happened to be queer and be in touch with his feminine side or something like that. So, we need more men that are open to are allow themselves to be constructively criticized, to open themselves to be corrected with grace and patience, and not be shamed. That's what it's saying. They need to be held accountable, but without shaming, because patriarchy teaches them so many harmful and toxic things that makes them shell out and turns them into a statue that really is a lot filled with lies. And she also says here, responsible men are capable of self-criticism. If more men were doing the work of self-critique, then they would not be wounded, hurt, or chagrined when critiqued by others, especially women with whom they are intimate. Engaging in self-critique empowers responsible males to admit mistakes. When they have wronged others, they are willing to acknowledge wrongdoing and make amends. When others have wronged them, they are able to forgive. The ability to be forgiving is part of letting go of perfectionism and accepting vulnerability. At the same time, constructive criticism works only when it is linked to a process of affirmation. Giving affirmation is an act of emotional care. Wounded men are not often able to say anything positive. They are the grump and groan guys, cloaked in cynicism. They stand at an emotional distance from themselves and others. Affirmation brings us closer together. It is the highest realization of compassion and empathy with others. One of the negative aspects of anti-male feminist critiques of masculinity was the absence of any affirmation of that which is positive and potentially positive in male being. Yeah, so like I said, like men need to be in a process where they need to be accountable to themselves and others, and that's that in a way we have to look at that as a love. We got to look at that as like something that's not trying to tear down their character. It needs to be looked as something where they can see themselves being better and being responsible human beings. And this is the last chapter, which is titled Loving Men, chapter 11. And it talks about more about how patriarchy is like a war. And in this war, there needs to be communities of resistance. There needs to be an organized coalition, multi-gender, multi-racial coalition that needs to be against patriarchy. And she equated that with like the war in Iraq and Vietnam and anything of that sort. Like they're like when like social media titles gender war. No, it's like a war of patriarchy. Who plays the patriarchy game the best is like what is going on in those quote unquote gender wars. And one of the solutions that she offered is that to create the culture that will enable boys to love, we must see the family as having as its primary function the giving of love. Providing food and shelter are loving acts. Learning how to love in family life, boys and girls learn the relational skills needed to build community at home and in the world. So we need to get away from this idea that boys should not be feeling emotion. They should not express themselves in ways that allow them to be innocent and be given grace. They shouldn't be shamed for things that are seen as not masculine, and they can coexist with girls and women in a way that's not sexual, that's not romantic, that's not power centered, that's not competitive. Like, they can coexist in a community where they can humanize each other. And she also says here, to make this solid foundation, men must set the example by daring to heal, by daring to do the work of relational recovery. Irrespective of their sexual preferences, men in the process of self-recovery usually begin by returning to boyhood and evaluating what they learned about masculinity and how they learned it. Many males find it useful to pinpoint the moments where they realized who they were, what they felt, then suppress that knowledge because it was displeasing to others. Understanding the roots of male disease helps many men to begin the work of repairing the damage. So men have to unlearn a lot of toxic things that they learned when they were growing up. And she also says here, like the men who feel that patriarchy's promise has not been fulfilled, Mama feels that she is left with broken promises without a reward for performing the subordinate role she was told a good woman should perform. So she also says that women also have to do some deep soul searching and unlearn some problematic things that they were learning because of patriarchy and women's allegiance to patriarchy. And this is something another quote that I also love. She said, mutuality is different from equality. Love cannot coexist with domination. Love can exist in circumstances where equality is not the order of the day. Inequality in and of itself does not breed domination. It can heighten awareness of the need to be more loving. So we need to... That's what she said about feminism. And it was more talk about mutual love. So when like a woman and a man are a heteronormative relationship, so a heterosexual relationship, because heteronormative in itself is problematic, but a heterosexual relationship, the heterosexual men and women need to operate in a way where it's not dominator and subordinate. It needs to be a partnership. There needs to be some mutual respect for each other. There's no expectation of that person in a certain position and that person in a certain position. It works better when there's no imbalance of power. And it's when there's a collaborative effort and a partnership going on. And the last quote I'm going to bring here today is something that she referenced from an author named Kaylee Hagan, in which she testifies that the good men in her life and gave her hope and what is considered a good man, nice guys. That sometimes nice guys can be patriarchal as well. They can be violent as well behind closed doors, but here's genuine good men. And Kaylee Hagan says, for both men and women, good men can be somewhat disturbing to be around because they usually do not act in ways associated with typical men. They listen more than they talk. They self-reflect on their behavior and motives. They actively educate themselves about women's reality by seeking out women's culture and listening to women. They avoid using women for vicarious emotional expression. When they look to women for guidance and receive criticism with gratitude, they practice enduring uncertainty while waiting for a new way of being to reveal previously unconsidered alternatives to controlling and abusive behavior. They intervene in other men's misogynist behavior, even when women are not present, which is what those men's movements have not been doing clearly. And they work hard to recognize and challenge their own, Perhaps most amazingly, good men perceive the value of a feminist practice for themselves, and they advocate it not because it's politically correct or because they want women to like them or even because they want women to have equality, but because they understand that male privilege prevents them not only from becoming whole, authentic human beings, but also from knowing the truth about the world. They offer proof that men can change. And that is pretty much the work that Hooks is saying, that men need to do the work to actually do feminist work because women have been doing it for so long. And men also need to tackle some things that they have been learning, tackles the things that they've been operating, how it affects their work, how it affects their family, how it affects their selves, how it affects their community and society. They need to have a material analysis on how patriarchy has been contributing to their suffering. Because patriarchy, even though it puts you in this superior position, it's not going to save you. It's actually going to do more detriment to you and harm for yourself and the people that are with you on this experience. And that is Bell Hooks' Will to Change. Thank y'all for staying with me. I thought I was gonna have to make a third part, but I was able to get all those parts in within the time that I wanted to. So yes, stay tuned for another part of the series. Follow my book page at Raisin Souls, or depends how you are. I'll let you follow my personal Instagram at Intellectual Albert. And thank you. And I have to say, this book was a quick read. Like, I actually find it digestible. I always find Bell Hooks to be an accessible writer, so I definitely recommend this book. I would say All About Love was probably a good first book, and then this will probably be like a sequel to it, because a lot of the things she talked about in The Will to Change, she also talked about in All About Love, especially when it comes to like how power dynamics and relationships go, and what is considered genuine love. And it's away from this individualism, capitalist mindset into a more community and affirming and truthful way of being. And that is all. Stay tuned. I already said stay tuned. But y'all take care and bye.